The first time I noticed her, she was standing perfectly still at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, eyes locked on my front porch like she was trying to will it into compliance. Every cul-de-sac has someone like her. In our HOA, she was a gravitational center of every complaint and whisper, the name that floated through door cracks when letters marked "Notice of Violation" showed up in mailboxes. People called her Karen in the gentle, weary way you call a thunderstorm by the season it belongs to. I didn't plan to get in her path. I planned to mow my lawn on schedule, hang neutral wreaths during the holidays, and mind my business. All of that changed the day Maple, my rescue dog, patted into my life. Maple had soft ears that folded into perfect triangles when she was curious, which was often. She was the kind of dog that stopped to watch a bird in silence, or the kind that learned the rhythm of my footsteps and waited at the back door 5 minutes before I got home. She didn't bark without reason. She saved her voice for doorbells and squirrels. When I signed the closing papers on my small stucco house and skimmed the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the pet guidelines looked straightforward. Leashes outside, waste disposed of, excessive noise discouraged. In a neighborhood where we'd height and mailbox paint shades had strict paragraphs, excessive noise felt subjective enough to breathe. The first week was a checklist of compliance. New trash cans rolled to the curb at the exact property line. Grass cut to regulation height. Porch light replaced with the warm white tone mentioned in the handbook. Maple learned the fence line and lay under the creep myrtle during sunsets, content to watch kids carve zigzags down the sidewalk on scooters. That's when Karen started her stakeouts. She'd appear without warning, phone in hand, holding it chest level like it was a badge that came with authority. I would find her footprints in the strip of mulch that ran beside my lawn, toes pointed toward the fence slats, as if inches closer might catch Maple committing a misdemeanor. The first letter arrived 3 weeks in. The HOA logo sat like a municipal seal in the top corner. The salutation was polite. The body was not. Multiple homeowner reports indicate ongoing nuisance barking from a canine at your address. The word nuisance carried a fine schedule. It escalated like a staircase you couldn't see the top of, warning, then $50, then $100, then further legal action. The letter was dated on a Monday. That Monday I had been at work from 8 to 5. Maple had been inside, snoozing on the couch under a sunbeam you could tell time by. The neighbors on either side, an elderly couple who shared citrus when their tree was generous, and a nurse who worked nights and prized silence, had only ever cooed at Maple through the fence. None of them had complained. That left one person. I knocked the anxiety out of my chest by walking the block with Maple on a short lead, nodding to the people who chose shrubs that bloomed in HOA-approved colors. The rules were designed for sameness. The sameness was supposed to buy us peace. But it was as if the sameness made the smallest deviation feel like an offense, and offenses were Karen's oxygen. She began pacing the sidewalk at deliberate times, late afternoon, just as a school bus sighed to a stop early evening, when first dinners were in the oven. She never spoke to me. She didn't need to. Her posture did the talking, and the letters did the rest. I learned the letter timetable by heart. If there was a complaint on Monday, there was a warning on Wednesday, and a courtesy call on Friday. The calls came from a block number, the voice on the other end using the neutral phrasing of someone trained to avoid argument. We received additional reports. The reports were always vague. They never quoted a timestamp precise enough to anchor truth. They were the kind of accusations that could rest their weight on a sigh you let out after a long day and label it a disturbance. I kept my cool because I assumed reason would show up if I invited it kindly. I started small. I rearranged Maple's routine so she spent more of the day inside. I borrowed a baby monitor with a camera and a motion trigger and set it in the living room, red light blinking. I downloaded a decibel meter app, the kind noise-averse parents use to test if a cafe is too loud for a sleeping infant. I made lists with times and readings. I walked the fence line and tightened any slat that complained. Each night I stacked my notes neatly on the kitchen counter like study material for an exam I never planned to take. The second letter didn't wait for Monday. It came on a Saturday afternoon when the street was full of laughter and lawnmowers, and someone 2 houses down was showing off a pressure washer that could peel gum from a sidewalk like fruit skin. Second notice. It said at the top, bold enough to bruise. Failure to comply with noise mitigation standards. It cited Section 7.2.3 of our CC&R Section 7.2.3, did not mention dogs by name, but the paragraph's vague language was large enough to hold any pet someone resented. There was a line at the bottom that said, "A hearing may be scheduled at the next board meeting to determine appropriate action." The implication hung in the air, heavy as humidity. I found the date of the next board meeting on the HOA website, hidden under 3 clicks and a PDF icon that opened like a trapdoor. The agenda included landscaping contracts, a broken swing at the park, and noise incident review. I added it to my calendar and felt a clarity sharpen behind my eyes. This wasn't going to be solved by hoping pettiness would exhaust itself. Pettiness gathers energy from attention, but it also leaves evidence. If it was going to be my word against an orbit of anonymous reports, then word would need to become record. That evening, as the sunset turned the street into a postcard of palms and stucco, Maple dozed at my feet and the baby monitor hummed. Across the way, Karen stood on her driveway again, tapping her phone, looking at my house like it was a puzzle she enjoyed assembling. Neighbors slid their trash cans back discreetly. A garage door creaked open, and a teenager disappeared inside with a skateboard tucked under his arm. The block wore its normalcy like a uniform. Underneath the uniform, something had begun to fray. By the time the streetlights clicked on with clockwork precision, I had a plan. It involved timers, spreadsheets, a spare memory card, and the small but powerful relief that comes when you know you've moved from defense to documentation. If the board wanted to talk about noise, I would arrive with a full day per page, annotated. If the complaint's timestamps didn't match reality, the mismatch would glow like a backlit sign. And if the complaints kept coming while Maple lay still as folded laundry, then we would all be forced to say out loud what the letters refused to. This wasn't about a dog. It was about a person determined to turn dislike into policy. The only thing I didn't yet know was why. She had the kind of immaculate lawn that took graph paper and patience. She drove a car that always looked detailed. Her porch was a default in the HOA handbook. People like that chase order until order becomes a point. Maybe Maple was a symbol of the one variable that couldn't be measured, the way a living creature breathes, sighs, dreams. Maybe the sound of an honest life didn't fit the sound she wanted on her street. Or maybe it was simpler. Maybe it was me, a new neighbor, easy to pressure because I still felt like a guest in a place she thought she owned. The baby monitor recorded the night in grayscale. At 2:11 a.m., a passing car flicked its headlights across the ceiling, drawing brief rectangles of light. Maple raised her head, then settled. At 5:03 a.m., sprinklers hissed awake somewhere down the block. Maple did not move. At 6:47 a.m., the first bird began their complicated songs. Maple trotted to the back door and sat, waiting. When I opened the Cloud app in the morning and scrolled through the timeline, there were no barks. There was only quiet, proof stitched in pixels. The first weekend passed like that, calm and measured. It would be the last quiet one for a while. Because on Monday, 2 things arrived. A note taped to my door that said, "Control your animal," in block letters that pretended to be anonymous, and a calendar invite from the HOA property manager for a compliance hearing. The subject line used my address like a case file. The location was a community room, the one with the echo that makes whispers sound louder than they are. The invite time was placed just early enough to make people rush through dinner. My plan to stay small and agreeable was done. The only way through now was forward, with everything on the record. I took Maple for a long walk that evening, tracing quiet loops through our streets, memorizing the way our block sounded when it belonged to its residents instead of to rules. My grief wasn't dramatic. It was the ordinary grief of realizing kindness alone is not a strategy. But there was something useful embedded in it. Resolve. I could be kind and meticulous at the same time. I could obey rules and still expect them to be applied fairly. I could own a dog and also own my peace. In my kitchen, the stack of notes had become a binder. The Decibel app had produced graphs. The baby monitor had clipped highlights. The plan had a spine. Across the street, Karen's garage door opened, and light spilled onto a driveway. In the back of the garage, stacked neatly against a firewall, I saw boxes labeled with tidy black handwriting. Some people packed for vacations. Some people packed for moves. In that moment, I didn't know which kind of boxes those were. I only knew the shape of them, and that they had corners, and that corners come back to point at you. The community room would test what those corners were made of. The hearing would tell me who I was living among. The next chapter in this story would not be whispered through thin slats or written on anonymous notes. It would be read into the minutes. And if those minutes were honest, they would have to include the sound that defined my house. Not a bark, but a breath, steady and soft, from a dog asleep in the safety of a home she had finally found. The community room lived behind the pool, a long rectangle of beige walls and stackable chairs, half storage closet and half stage. On meeting nights, it filled with a mix of perfume and cut grass that defined our neighborhood, people in golf shirts and flats carrying folders like shields. The board sat at a folding table with tinted name cards, the president in the middle, the property manager to her right, the compliance chair to her left. Their expressions were rehearsed in neutrality. A voice recorder sat in the center, small red light blinking, swallowing everything for the minutes. Above them, a whiteboard held a grid of agenda items written with a squeaky marker, noise incident review third on the list. I arrived early with a binder tucked under my arm and a USB drive in my pocket. Maple stayed home, dozing with a baby monitor's eye on her. In my head, I had rehearsed the story in the shape of facts, date, time, decibel reading, screenshot. I wasn't there to be emotional. I was there to be precise. Precision leaves less room for bias to slip in and pretend to be policy. Before my item surfaced, the room handled its routine business. A landscaping contract was renewed with a number that made someone in the back mutter. A discussion about repainting the playground slide turned into a tangent about shade canopies. People clutched their coffee cups like flotation devices. Then the president cleared her throat and announced a review of a resident complaint regarding animal noise at my address. The neutrality dissolved at the edges. There's a particular energy that enters a room when it's about to divide itself into sides. The property manager summarized the complaints with the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Multiple reports, spanning 3 weeks, varying times. There were no names attached to the reports, only timestamps and the phrase, nuisance barking. The word nuisance tried to carry more authority than it had owned. When the president handed me the floor, I felt an unexpected calm. I slid the binder onto the table, clicked open the decibel charts, and let the evidence do the talking I wasn't allowed to do. The charts were simple, lines that hugged the bottom axis for hours and lifted only when a truck passed or the doorbell rang or a leaf blower down the block did what leaf blowers do. Against those lines, I placed the complaint timestamps the HOA claimed to have received. The mismatch was obvious. Where the complaint said 10:30 a.m., continuous barking, the graph showed a flat line and a clip from the baby monitor of Maple asleep on the rug, twitching once at a dream she didn't tell me about. Where a report said 7 p.m., barking for 30 minutes. The clip showed my TV playing a baseball game at a volume that registered low and a delivery truck pausing at the curb. The property manager leaned closer to the screen. The president's pen stopped tapping, and a couple in the second row exchanged a look that carried the relief of vindication you feel when you recognize a tactic someone has used on you before. I did not say names. I did not mention the footprints in my mulch. I did not lift the anonymous note like a flag. I just let the weight of conflict rest where it belonged, on inconsistency. When it ended, the president thanked me with formality and said the board would deliberate. They moved to the next agenda item, but the room's attention didn't follow. Down the row, on the compliance chair's right, sat Karen. She wasn't on the board. She was on the compliance committee, a distinction that stacked power indirectly but effectively. The committee fed the board. The board signed the letters. The letters shaped people's days. Karen had learned the path to the lever and stood with one finger on it at all times. She sat straight-backed, legs crossed at the ankle, papers in a folder that matched the HOA's beige. Her eyes flicked past me the way you look past a painting you've decided not to like. When the board called a 5-minute recess, she stayed seated, scrolling through her phone with the practiced intensity of someone who documents the world as justification. I stepped outside into the chlorine-scented air and took a long breath. The pool lights turned the water into a turquoise sheet. Somewhere behind the palm trees, a freeway exhaled. 2 neighbors approached. One of them the night shift nurse who loved her quiet and had the calm that comes from knowing what real emergencies look like. She didn't say anything, just nodded once in a way that translated to "you're not crazy." The gesture loosened a knot between my shoulders I didn't know I'd been holding. The board filed back in and read their conclusion in the same tone they might announce a trash pickup delay. At this time, the board will issue no fines but will monitor the situation. It was administrative language, for we'd prefer this to resolve without us. It felt like a stalemate. The letter machine didn't ratchet forward tonight, but it hadn't been dismantled. I didn't leave with punishment, but I didn't leave with peace. Monitoring implied more eyes. More eyes implied more reports. Reports were the power source of this entire ecosystem. That night, back home, I set the binder on the counter and looked at the baby monitor's timeline. The clips were uneventful, the way you want life clips to be. Maple's breath, Maple's stretch, Maple's shift from floor to couch and back again. The uneventfulness itself had become evidence. But evidence alone doesn't stop a person who keeps pushing until resistance wears down. Some people need a boundary taller than a fence. They need a wall built out of their own rules, placed in front of them like a mirror. If I could find her reflection in the CC and RS, maybe the same system that allowed her to file anonymous reports could be leveraged to hold her accountable where she actually violated the uniform she worshipped. I reread the CC and RS. The PDF's table of contents had the dry precision of a textbook, but between the lines you could see what the people who wrote it feared. Bright paint, loud cars, holiday blow-ups, non-standard shingles. Buried in the middle were clauses about architectural modifications without prior approval, use of property for business purposes, and short-term rental prohibited under city ordinance and association policy. I knew from neighborhood gossip that she had a second refrigerator in her garage for client beverages. I knew because the door stayed open when people came and went during daylight hours, and coolers were loaded into trunks. I knew because a hand-painted sign had once sat briefly by her mailbox advertising porch minis, a term I had only half understood until I saw family after family pose for photos on her steps during a weekend in November. The CC and RS were allergic to commerce conducted from front porches. They allowed home offices, the quiet kind that hid behind closed doors, but they forbade signs, client traffic, and any business that altered the residential character. A porch photography business altered the character. So did rentals shorter than 30 days. I was certain I had seen a moving carousel of cars in her driveway that matched the timeline of weekend rentals. But certainty and proof are cousins who don't live at the same address. Proof lives in records. I opened my laptop and started searching. Public records don't give you everything, but they give you enough if you know where to look. County permitting databases listed approved structures. If there was a pergola or a shed that hadn't been approved, I would find a gap. Property tax records showed the assessed value jumps that trailed major additions. Real estate listings cached by search engines remembered old photos even when you think you've scrubbed the internet. On a local by a cell group, I found a post from 2 summers ago offering weekend porch sessions, time slots, and pricing that made me wince. On a travel site that rhymed with fair Airbnb, I found a listing with her front steps, same planters, same door wreath, but the house number blurred with clumsy editing. The listing had been temporarily deactivated, which in internet terms means it exists. Each find went into a folder. Screenshots were dated meticulously. I matched photos to timestamps when possible. I compared them to Google Street View's historic imagery to track when a new trellis appeared over her side gate, offering shade that was not in the approved pallet section. On the city's code enforcement site, I skimmed the ordinance that backed the HOA's short-term rental ban. It was explicit and newly amended, the ink barely dry. Enforcement was complaint-driven. Complaints needed addresses. Addresses required cautious language and attached files. The next morning, I filed an inspection of record requests with the HOA, a right buried in the bylaws that most homeowners never exercise because they don't imagine they'll need to. It asked to review committee rosters, violation logs by address, with identifying complainant information redacted, architectural requests and approvals for the past 3 years, and any board minutes that reference enforcement actions in our cul-de-sac. The property manager responded with a template acknowledgement and a promise to arrange a time within statutory limits. I read that as, "We'll do it because we have to." While I waited, I adjusted my route when I walked Maple, so we looped past the city's code enforcement office. The building had the same municipal smell every city building has, a mix of toner and air conditioning. A clerk gave me a number and a form and pointed to a poster on the wall that outlined common code violations. Illegal rentals and unpermitted structures sat next to abandoned vehicles and weeds over 8 inches tall. I filed a report with the travel site screenshots attached and the ordinance number cited in the subject line. I was careful with tone. An angry complaint can be dismissed as spite. A meticulous one feels inevitable. At home, Maple dozed. The baby monitor collected proof of quiet like a jar collects rain. Across the street, Karen's garage door opened and closed with the punctuality of a metronome. Clients or guests or friends, whatever label made it feel acceptable, came and went. Her porch remained a backdrop. Her social media, public in places she assumed were private enough, revealed a stream of photos that used the HOA's aesthetic as currency. The neutral palette had become a brand. The brand had become business. The business had become a habit. Habits are only harmless until they cross a line drawn by the same people who encourage their cultivation. The HOA scheduled my records inspection for the following week in the same community room where my hearing had been held. When the day came, a property manager sat at the folding table with a box of files and a legal pad. The files smelled faintly of dust and authority. I signed a form promising not to remove anything, and then I started reading like I was trying to find my name on a long roll call. It took less than an hour to find what I was looking for. The violation logs listed addresses, dates, and codes. My address had a tight cluster with the same vague description. 2 other addresses on our street had similar clusters over the past year, both resolved without fines after evidence insufficient. And then there was hers. Nothing. Either she was the most compliant resident in the history of suburban rulebooks, or the system that caught me with speed and enthusiasm was blind to the obvious in her direction. Blindness isn't an accident when the person sculpting the view stands between you and the window. In the architectural approvals file, I found applications for fences, pergolas, and porch columns. Names were blacked out. Addresses were not. 2 addresses down, an application for a decorative trellis had been denied. The reason was precise, non-compliant material and color. The trellis that now arched over her side gate matched the denied design. There was no corresponding approved application. It existed because someone decided rules were for other people. Someone who sat on a committee that helped write the denials. When I asked to see the compliance committee roster, the property manager hesitated, then pointed to the section of the bylaws that made rosters available to members upon request. She produced a list. The chair was a man I barely knew. The members included 2 names I recognized and one that carried no surprise, Hayes. There was a note in the minutes about recusal required when conflicts arise, a phrase that does a lot of heavy lifting in places where power and proximity overlap. I asked to review any documented recusals. There weren't any. I didn't leave the community room angry. I left with the sober focus of a person holding reinforced facts. This wasn't personal friction anymore. It was a structure problem. A person who filed or fueled anonymous complaints sat in judgment from a seat that required impartiality. A person who installed unapproved structures had a hand in denying others permission. A person who appeared to host short-term rentals lived under a policy that prohibited them and helped enforce that policy on others. The same system that had turned Maple into paperwork could now be used, fairly and without theatrics, to hold her to the standard she made a career of insisting on. At home, I scanned the most relevant files and added them to the folder with a screenshot from the travel site and the porch mini-sessions. I drafted 2 emails, one to the HOA board with my findings, requesting a special agenda item to address conflicts of interest in enforcement, and one to the city's code enforcement attaching the CC&R excerpts and the HOA's own prohibition as supporting context for my rental complaint. I kept my language dry, the way a good report is dry. Dry makes it harder to accuse you of being emotional. Dry lets the facts shine. The next day, the Code Enforcement Office sent an acknowledgement with a case number. The HOA sent a brief response. My item will be added to the next board meeting. I didn't have to imagine how news travels in neighborhoods like ours. You could feel it in the way people lingered an extra beat at their mailboxes, in the way someone's garage stayed open as if they might need to step in and out quickly for more conversation. These places are ecosystems of information. The same networks that pass along babysitter names pass along warnings about who is causing trouble. I have been recast in some living rooms. So be it. Trouble, when it is simply a person asking for the rules to be applied evenly, is a reputation I can live with. That evening, Maple and I sat on the back steps while the sky traded blue for color between peach and gray. Somewhere a grill popped and hissed. A basketball thumped 2 streets over. Normal life insisted on itself. It was the best argument against petty control I'd ever heard. In the morning, the city would begin its process. In a week, the board would open its meeting with the unusual tension that arrives when one of your own has been named in a polite but pointed email. The binder on my counter no longer felt like a defense. It felt like a blueprint. The thing about people who build their identity on rules is that they never imagine the rules turning in their direction. When they do, it isn't revenge, it's gravity. What goes up must come down. Anonymous complaints float, but documentation has weight. The next chapter wouldn't be about a dog at all. It would be about a person learning what a boundary feels like when it's real. The code enforcement officer showed up without spectacle, a white sedan that blended into the line of SUVs and mid-sized sedans resting in driveways like sleepy whales. He wore the uniform of someone whose days alternate between weeds too tall and fences built 2 inches into easements. Clipboard, camera, a roll of orange tags that could bloom on a notice board like a new flower. He did not park in front of her house. He parked at the corner and walked the length of our cul-de-sac like a person who understood that seeing the whole is often the fastest way to understand a part. I pretended not to watch. Most of the block pretended not to as well, blinds opening just enough to let curiosity through. He paused at her side gate and took a photo of the trellis arcing over it. The material was shade the CC and RS did not recognize as permissible. He stood at the base of her driveway, tapped a note into his phone, and then simply took in the porch, the planters, the permanent hooks that made seasonal decor installation efficient, the chalk mark on the stoop that looked like a photographer's focus point. People often leave artifacts of habit in plain sight. A trained eye turns artifacts into a timeline. He did not knock. He took measurements. He left a door hanger printed in stern font that politely announced a visit had occurred. An hour later, another car arrived. City logo on the door, second officer in tow. 2 visits in a day signal more than weeds. They signal that a complaint carried enough documentation to move from inbox to schedule. Our block, always quiet, turned quieter. The gravity shifted almost imperceptibly from my porch to Hayes. The HOA's response moved in parallel. The next board meeting had been promoted from sleepy variance approvals to an event. The agenda, posted on the website in PDF format, no one had read the week before, now had hits. Conflict of interest and enforcement standards had been added. The phrase wrapped its long arms around specific facts with formality that took away their gossip flavor. I prepared like the careful person I am. That preparation is not a personality quirk. It is a survival strategy. I organized a folder into 3 sections. The first, evidence of my dog's quiet. The graphs, the monitor clips, the log of complaint timestamps that did not align with reality. The second, architectural violations visible from the street and documented by public records. The trellis, the porch additions, the deactivated rental listing with photos dated within the period our HOA's ban was in place. The third, the committee roster and the minutes establishing requirements for recusal, alongside the absence of any such recusals recorded during periods when my address and others had been subject to enforcement actions. Each section was introduced with 1 page of plain English summary. If you hand people a 100-page packet, they will drown. If you give them a map on the first page and arrows at every turn, they will arrive where truth stands. The day of the meeting, the community room filled to the edges of its folding walls. People leaned against door frames and stood at the back with the polite restlessness of those who didn't bring chairs because they didn't expect to stay long. They stayed. The board began with routine items to warm up their voices. Then they called my agenda item. The room stilled in a way that made even the air conditioner hesitate. The president asked me to summarize. I did so succinctly. Then I asked for my USB to be inserted into the room's projector. The property manager complied, and the screen filled with a timeline of Maple's quiet days, a river of low readings punctuated by life, a delivery, a friend's laugh, a single bark at a door knock, and then a quick return to soft. I showed the complaint times and the non-matching clips. I watched faces in the room register relief, frustration, recognition. Then I moved on. The porch photos appeared next. The trellis, measured in the city officer's photo against a tape pulled from his belt, its material flagged in the CC and RS as disallowed. A screen capture of the HOA architectural denial at a similar address for a similar structure. The porch minis post, with date overlay, and the travel site listing deactivated but still cached. A screenshot of the city ordinance banning rentals under 30 days in the section of our CC and RS that echoed it with board policy language. I did not include her name or her address in bold font. The room didn't need me to. I included the facts. Finally, I displayed the committee roster and the recusal requirement. I asked a simple procedural question. How does a committee ensure members recuse themselves when they are involved, directly or indirectly, in enforcement matters touching their immediate neighbors? The president looked at the compliance chair. The compliance chair looked at the property manager. The property manager looked at the minutes and then at the audience. There was no answer to point to. Silence took the shape of a missing process. The room's energy changed. It wasn't just a thriller drama. It was a complicated communal side that escapes when a pattern finally gets a label. People shifted from foot to foot. Someone coughed and then caught themselves. Then the president did the thing good leaders do when backed up against the truth. She opened the floor to comments. What followed was not a pile-on. It was a release. The elderly couple 2 houses down described a similar cluster of complaints last spring that evaporated when they began recording their own timelines. A parent described the time their Halloween decorations prompted a letter while a more elaborate display down the block earned a photo feature in the HOA newsletter. A pattern emerged. Anonymous complaints flowed in one direction more often than was coincidental, and compliance scrutiny slid away from those closest to it. Karen sat in the second row, photo on her lap, expression flat. The flatness read to some as dignity, to others as calculation. Her gaze moved across the room like a scan, taking in where loyalties lay. I felt no triumph at her discomfort. What I felt was relief. I had worried that the room would decide the easiest outcome. Both sides at fault. Everyone calmed down. Instead, the room did the more difficult task of naming imbalance. Procedural reform is not as cinematic as someone shouting or storming out. It is steadier. The board recessed to consult. When they returned, the president read a series of motions crafted on the fly but with surprising clarity. First, all enforcement actions relying on anonymous reports must include corroborating evidence, such as recordings or multiple named witnesses. Second, committee members must recuse themselves from any enforcement matter within their immediate block and any matter involving a complainant with whom they have had prior conflicts, and such recusals must be documented in the minutes. Third, a moratorium on enforcement actions regarding my address would stand until an independent review concluded. Finally, the Compliance Committee would be reconstituted at the next annual meeting due to erosion of community trust. Each motion passed with a raised hand count that tilted heavily toward yes. After, people filed out with the quiet of a congregation processing a sermon that unsettled but clarified. I gathered my USB drive and slid it into my pocket. As I stepped outside, the code enforcement officer's sedan rolled past the pool toward the exit. He didn't see me. He was thinking about his next stop. That's the thing about systems. No matter how personal they feel while you're inside them, they are, at their best, impersonal when they function correctly. The officer had a job. The board now had a process. The binder had found its place in the sequence. The next morning, an orange tag appeared on her side gate trellis. Notice of violation, unpermitted structure. It flapped slightly in the morning breeze, a bright punctuation mark in a paragraph that had been too long. In the afternoon, a notice was taped to her door, the kind thick paper that's hard to miss even if you pretend you didn't see it. The travel site listing, when I checked again, no longer appeared even in cache. Sometimes, people fix what they can fix quickly. Structures take longer. What changed most visibly wasn't the paper. It was the way the block walked. People waved longer. Neighbors who had previously avoided catching one another's eye lingered at property lines to thank, to ask a question, to share a story. The act of naming a pattern brought us back into a neighborhood instead of a sequence of adjacent compliance projects. The HOA exists for shared maintenance and order, but order without community curdles into control. We had stepped back toward balance, one agenda item at a time. Karen's reaction was quieter than I expected. No door slams, no posted screeds. She pulled her car into the garage more quickly. The porch that had functioned as a set remained empty. Her blind stayed drawn during hours when she used to let light spill onto the steps. The block's energy adjusted to the vacuum. That's not schadenfreude. It's a physics of social space. When someone withdraws, others flow around the absence. Lawns still grow. Kids still ride scooters. Dogs still nap in rectangles of light. I knew it wasn't over. Enforcement processes take time, and people with control habits do not release them like helium balloons. They clutch the string and pretend the balloon is holding them down. But for the first time since the first letter, I slept without my shoulders braced against the next accusation. Maple, feeling that relaxation in whatever way dogs measure the air, stretched long and sighed like a contented person after a long chore. The baby monitor recorded mostly emptiness, as if it too had let go. A small sign appeared in her yard 2 days later, a discreet logo, the name of a well-known local real estate team, and the terse word "coming soon." It felt surreal and ordinary at the same time. Houses get listed all the time. People move for reasons that have nothing to do with a trellis or a short-term rental policy or a committee roster. And yet timing carries messages. Some messages are loud. Some are written in white on a small sign stuck into perfect grass. The next chapter would reveal whether coming soon meant a slow negotiation or something more abrupt. In the space between those possibilities, the block took another collective breath. The real estate listing went live on a Wednesday morning, a slick carousel of photos that made every corner glow like a catalog. The porch that had served as a set for countless sessions now wore the neutral anonymity of a stage cleared between acts. The trellis over the side gate did not appear in any collage. Where side angle should have been, there was a tasteful shot of a plant instead. Description sided with adjectives that signal compliance, updated within guidelines, quiet street, well-maintained. The listing agent knew the audience. The audience knew the block. Both knew that pictures contain as much omission as truth. What speed followed surprised even me. A photographer's post vanished. A neighbor mentioned seeing a handyman haul lumber from the side yard. The orange tag disappeared. In its place, a pile of neatly bundled scrap leaned against a trash can at the curb, waiting for bulk pickup. Code enforcement plays a long game, but sometimes the presence of their tape measure accelerates people's priorities. The travel site profile, deactivated and scrubbed, left ghost breadcrumbs in places that didn't matter for enforcement but mattered for narrative. Narrative would not fix anything legal, but it would remind those paying attention why systems exist. The HOA sent a notice to members explaining the new enforcement policy changes in language that balanced humility and firmness. It cited community input and best practices, phrases that translate to "we heard you" and "we want to make this right" without admitting wrongdoing. The compliance committee chair tendered a resignation in a one-sentence email that was included in the minutes. The rest of the committee was placed on hiatus pending the next election. A temporary panel composed of board members and 2 volunteers from outside our street would handle outstanding matters. The description was bureaucratic, and that was perfect. Bureaucracy, when applied evenly and with paperwork in order, can be a relief. I didn't speak to the listing agent. I didn't gossip at the mailbox. The binder stayed on my counter not because I still needed it, but because I did not want to signal to myself that the lesson had been learned fully. People forget. Neighborhoods relapse into pettiness after their adrenaline fades. Systems calcify back into shape. But for the moment, this story was traveling with speed familiar to anyone who has ever watched a moment after the dam cracks. The water finds a path of least resistance. Hey, resistance had finally been applied where it belonged, and the spillover flowed away. Showings began Thursday. The parade of shoes, the practical kind of real estate agents and the excited kind of buyers, moved in scripted rhythms. In, out, a whispered consultation at the driveway's edge, a glance at the small lawn sign with a logo that assured them their bid would be handled professionally. Our block performed the choreography neighborhood performed during sales. Lawns edged more sharply, trash cans tucked discreetly, kids reminded to keep bikes neat. The urge to be chosen lives deep in stucco and grass communities. Being chosen props up property values, and property values are the secular religion of HOAs. Karen was visible only in flashes. She stood once at the picture window, then disappeared as the agent's key toned in the lock. A moving truck idled at the curb for 10 minutes on Friday, and then drove off without loading a single box. On Saturday morning, a pod container arrived and sat on the curb occupying the space where showings would normally park. The inconvenience felt intentional. Petty, even at the end. Petty is an addiction that doesn't let go easily. That afternoon, the city officer returned. He knocked this time. I didn't hear the conversation, but I saw the posture, his neutral but taking notes, haze, controlled, chin lifted. He left a printed notice. The words "case closed" don't always mean resolved to our satisfaction, but they do mark a point in a timeline. The trellis was down, the listing gone, the porch business invisible. Enforcement closes files when compliance is achieved or penalties are paid. Which occurred here. I didn't know. The point of rules isn't punishment. It's return to baseline. The block's temperature continued dropping. Relief, like a fever breaking, made small talk easier. People who had quietly resentful stories brought them into the open, and then let them go the way you let go of a balloon you forgot you were holding. Maple walked her loops and was greeted without second glances to see who might be watching. No one left anonymous notes. The baby monitor remained on, a tool that now functioned more like security than defense. Sometimes the act of gathering proof is what lets you stop needing to. An offer went pending faster than anyone expected. The sign sprouted a red banner with the word "under contract." In markets like ours, that can mean anything from excitement to desperation. It often means, "get me out of this chapter." The inspection period ticked by without visible drama. The pod was loaded in one afternoon with quiet efficiency that suggested professionals who specialize in the art of moving people quickly without commentary. The house that had once broadcast a personality now had the blank look of a stage reset. I thought about the first days, the letters, the meetings, the binder, the clipboards. I thought about how close I'd come to accepting the slow erosion of peace as a cost of living under a shared set of rules. It is easy to be reasonable alone. It is harder to be reasonable in a community shaped by people who conflate control with safety. What changed the story's direction was not anger. It was application. The same policies wielded like a cudgel were reproposed into a mirror and held still. That mirror is not revenge. It's an opportunity for reflection. If some people refuse a reflection, they often leave rather than look. On the last day before her move, a contractor's truck pulled up, and 2 men removed the permanent hooks from the porch beam. The beam looked delicate without them, like a face without earrings after years of wearing them daily. The grass, trimmed and edged, had the slightly stunned look lawns get when they are asked to be perfect for photographs. The house would make the next person happy if the next person needed neutral. Some people do. Neutral isn't a crime. It's a choice. Neighbors drifted out that evening as the sun lowered and did the passive wave that stands in for goodbye when relationships have been defined more by avoidance than by friendship. She stood at the edge of her driveway and nodded once at the block. The nod did not ask for conversation. It acknowledged shared proximity and ended it. The pod door ratcheted closed. The truck hooked it and pulled away, and in the space it left, two kids started an impromptu game of catch, the arcs of the ball cutting through air that felt lighter. In my kitchen, the binder looked too large for what remained. I took out the sections on Maple's Quiet and slid them into a folder labeled Home, Records. I kept the CC&R highlights handy, but put away. I do not want to live in a state of readiness. I want to live in a place where I can trust the process. That trust must be maintained by vigilance without paranoia, a balance that neighborhoods struggle to hold. We had recalibrated, at least for now. As night came, the cul-de-sac sounded like a cul-de-sac. A television laugh track drifted from somewhere. A sprinkler coughed and then found its rhythm. Maple climbed onto the couch, circled, and settled with a sigh that sounded like closure. There was one more step. The closing day, the small ritual of keys changing hands, the sign dropping from the lawn and leaning against the real estate team's trunk. People hold their breath between under contract and sold. I realized I had been holding mine too. Morning found a sold rider clipped to the sign. By late afternoon, a car we hadn't seen before pulled into the driveway, a couple stepping out with that squint that says, "This is ours," in the pleased way new owners do. They waved. The wave carried none of the weight of the past. It was just a wave. The arc of this story would close with a cardboard box in the kitchen and a dog asleep in the sun. Sometimes that's all justice asked for, normal that doesn't need defending. But a week is not just a measurement. It is a story arc. The timing made it viral-worthy in the gossip economy of neighborhoods. She moved out in a week. It wasn't literally 7 days from start to finish, but from the moment the orange tag flapped to the moment the sold sign clicked, the block counted time in a new way. Drama loves speed. Resolution can move fast when resistance finally meets the right surface. We had found that surface, accountability. The next chapter would not belong to her. It would belong to the people who stayed in the small agreements that make shared space livable. Leash your dogs, cut your grass, keep your music at a level that lets neighbors keep their thoughts. I didn't expect utopia. I expected meetings with donut boxes and budgets and paint swatches. That's the good stuff, if you learn to see it. That's where most of us live our lives. The days after moving truck leaves are defined by two sounds: the hollow echo in rooms where furniture once absorbed noise and the faint clink of new dishes unpacked next door. The couple who bought the house were younger, their energy different, their porch unadorned except for a doormat that made a small joke about shoes. They waved a lot in those first days, and the waving felt like fresh paint drying, hopeful, a little sticky, not quite set. The block, trained to flinch, unclenched by degrees. It takes practice to stop anticipating conflict. The HOA, sensing opportunity in the quiet, got practical. The board published a revised Good Neighbor Practices Guide, a version of the rules written with fewer capital letters and more examples. Instead of no excessive noise, it said, "Here's what neighbors usually find peaceful. Quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m., leashes always. One courtesy knock if a dog is barking." They borrowed from our binder in the best way, recommending decibel meter apps for disputes so noise could be described with numbers instead of adjectives. Numbers aren't perfect, but they are less likely to be weaponized than nuisance. They instituted a simple policy: anonymous reports will be logged but not acted upon without corroboration. That small line changed the ecosystem. It discouraged drive-by complaints and encouraged conversations. People realized that if a situation bothered them enough to report, it should matter enough to attach a name. Names have a way of moderating behavior. Anonymity has a way of inflating it. The compliance committee, reborn with members from 3 different blocks and a requirement that each serve with someone they didn't know well, started each meeting by reading the recusal rule out loud. Rituals form culture. Culture resists drift. I found myself doing normal things again without scanning for watches. I trimmed a creep myrtle without wondering if someone would measure the limb length against the handbook. Maple's routine stabilized into the kind of predictable loop that makes dogs happiest. Morning walk, nap in the sun, afternoon loop, dinner on time. She barked at the doorbell sometimes because that is what a good dog does. Then she stopped because the person on the other side of the door wasn't a threat. The baby monitor retired to a drawer not because we had nothing left to prove, but because we had nothing left to defend. Neighbors changed too. The night shift nurse slept without earplugs again and smiled more in the mornings when we crossed paths. The elderly couple 2 houses down put a small bench under their citrus tree and invited people to take a piece when it ripened. Those small gestures felt like rain after a dry season, not dramatic, but necessary. Communities are not built at board meetings. They are built on sidewalks at dusk and over shared tools and by people who choose to ask questions before filing forms. One afternoon, the HOA president stopped by with a packet labeled Pet Policy Clarification Draft. She asked if I would read it with an eye for the kind of clarity people need when they feel targeted. The draft struck a balance. It defined excessive with measurable criteria, suggested steps for owners to take before a complaint escalates, encouraged neighbor-to-neighbor conversations first, and provided a template for logging incidents that was specific enough to be useful but flexible enough to recognize nuance. I made 2 suggestions, one about clarifying how many minutes constitute sustained, and another about including a line that recognized that dogs, like humans, have lives that may occasionally produce sound. She took notes. The policy that later appeared on the website included both lines. The new neighbors settled in. They swapped out a porch light for a warmer tone without needing a lecture. They planted drought-tolerant shrubs in compliant colors. They brought over a plate of cookies that tasted like cake disguised as biscuit, and the gesture made its intended landing. We are here. We are friendly. We would like to be part of the organism without changing its DNA. Maple approved their presence by ignoring them after the first sniff, which is canine for you can stay. People asked me quietly, at first, what I would do with a binder now. The answer was simple. Keep it, then forget it. The forgetting wasn't denial. It was trust placed carefully in a process I had helped fix. I didn't want to be the person who clutched evidence years after the case had closed. I wanted to be the person who remembered how we fixed it, in case we needed to again. The difference matters. One keeps you brittle. The other keeps you ready without living in fight mode. Every so often, a car would roll slowly down the cul-de-sac and pause in front of the house with a sold rider gone, as if the street itself was a story they had heard and wanted to see the setting. You could spot the locals by the way they rolled their windows down to listen instead of just look. They didn't hear much. That was the point. The viral version of our story fit comfortably into a sentence. Karen wanted my dog gone. She moved out instead. The lived version sprawled messier and more useful than that, full of meetings and emails and polite motions and friendly policy drafts. Viral is satisfying to tell. Lived is what changes things. One morning, a wind blew through and flipped the last page of the HOA newsletter in my hand. The back carried a photo of a picnic at the park, folding tables, kids with chalk dust knees, a dog with a bandana. The caption thanked the volunteers who had organized the event and listed a series of small wins: new benches, repaired swing, a little free library approved for the corner by the pool. Those improvements didn't fix our old problem directly, but they were the fruit of a group that reoriented itself towards service instead of surveillance. Service is the antidote to control because it channels the urge to be involved into something measurable and good. Still, systems are not self-healing miracles. They drift. They require maintenance. A month after the move, a resident posted a screenshot on the community forum asking if anyone else had received a letter about lawn color. The tone had the brittle edge of someone bracing for battle because they had learned to expect it. Under the post, comments piled up fast, some complaining, some teasing, some asking for details. The property manager replied with a link to the new policy and an invitation to bring concerns to the next open forum. An old pattern would have let that post become a pile-on. The new pattern turned it into a calendar appointment and a set of bullet points. That is not excitement, but it is a win. Maple slept through most of this new stability. Dogs are the ultimate litmus test of a home's peace. When they sigh and sprawl shamelessly, you can trust the air. When they pace, something's wrong. We had moved from pacing to sprawling. On Saturdays, I watered the shrubs and chatted over the fence. On Sundays, I read on the porch while kids chalked elaborate hopscotch maps that stretched across driveways. The chalk dust on my walkway felt like the opposite of a violation. It felt like proof of life. One evening, as twilight gathered, the new neighbor set out 2 chairs on their porch and sat in them without turning it into a set. Passers-by waved. Maple watched a moth dance near the porch light and decided it didn't matter. The street hummed with low conversations and the kind of contentment that doesn't announce itself loudly. I realized then that this chapter of the story had an ending most HOA channels don't get to narrate because it doesn't spike the heart rate, a return to ordinary. There was one chapter left to write, not out of necessity but out of respect for arc stories like this should not end at sold. They should end at sustained. The last chapter would be a coda about what we learned and how to keep it. It would be about how to convert a viral moment into a durable culture. It would not be dramatic. It would be practical. That is the point. If anyone were to film the ending, they would be tempted to manufacture drama because quiet does not trend. But quiet is the achievement. The last chapter of this story looks like a spreadsheet of meeting dates, a porch with a standard light, a dog asleep on a rug, a rulebook that reads like a sensible manual instead of a weapon. It looks like a cul-de-sac that remembers itself. The HOA's reform settled into practice. Anonymous complaints were no longer the engine. When a noise issue surfaced, the process began with a courtesy notice that assumed good faith and invited a conversation. If that failed, a shared log with timestamps and, when possible, recordings help both sides step outside their feelings and look at fact together. The Compliance Committee, now composed of people who look for solutions instead of scalps, celebrated resolutions like small trophies. Screen door painted within pallet, shed moved off easement, basketball hoop deferred until architectural review. Those notes replaced the old hush that used to follow letters like the kind I had received. The neighborhood began to measure itself by the problems it solved rather than the people it sanctioned. We absorbed new residents with a friendliness that created fewer test cases. The welcome packet now included a Good Neighbor Practices guide alongside the CC and RS, and a magnet with the HOA's email so people knew where to ask before they guessed. The magnet seemed like nothing. It was not nothing. It said, "We are reachable." People derail less when they know where the rails are. On a personal level, I learned to calibrate my vigilance. I kept the baby monitor in a drawer and the decibel app on my phone, the way you keep a first aid kit stocked and hope not to use it. I kept the binder, now slimmer and labeled plainly, in a file cabinet. It wasn't a trophy. It was a tool that had done its job. Maple aged by months that felt like a long exhale, her face softer, her routine predictable. If a dog measures home by the constancy of its sounds and the confidence of its owner's footsteps, she measured ours and found it good. The home across the street continued its transformation from symbol to shelter. The new owners installed a rain chain that chimed gently during the 2 storms we were granted that season. They asked the board, by the book, for permission to add a small pergola in the backyard. They submitted the materials in the approved pallet, the dimensions within guidelines. The board approved the application in a meeting with little fanfare. The pergola rose without a single orange tag. The small victory wasn't the structure. It was a process handled without bitterness, without anyone needing to be humbled to arrive at compliance. Occasionally, people would still bring up the old chapter in a tone half joking, half cautious, as if testing whether the air could handle the memory. Remember when they would begin, then trail off, because the story they wanted to tell didn't match the current reality and might summon it back. I didn't avoid those conversations. I answered with the practical rather than the sensational. We updated the policy. I would say, Now they need corroboration. It's better. The past is less likely to recruit the present when you tell it in past tense, and keep the verb simple. The HOA's annual meeting arrived again. The room was half full, a sign of contentment. People tend to show up in droves when angry. They also show up when they're engaged. Half full might be the optimal balance. Enough participation to remind the board they are seen, not so much that the room becomes a courtroom. We elected 2 new members. One a quiet engineer, the other a teacher with a calm that had soothed dozens of kindergarten disputes. People with those temperaments anchor systems in the right ways. The president gave a short report on finances, a tighter one on enforcement metrics. The numbers told a story. Fewer complaints, faster resolutions, higher satisfaction on the annual survey. Someone applauded at the wrong moment and then laughed. Laughter in that room used to be rare and brittle. Now it was an easy exhale. The compliance chair, new, measured, read the recusal rule aloud as a ritual, and no one rolled their eyes. Rituals keep impatience from cutting corners. I walked home beneath the same streetlights that had once illuminated a different chapter, and thought about what revenge means when you refuse the cheap version. The cheap version demands spectacle. It wants the person who wronged you to suffer in a way you can point to. The durable version wants balance restored and process improved. So the wrong is harder to commit again. We got the durable version. The person at the center of the conflict left not because I persecuted her, but because, for the first time, the same rules she used were held up to her with steadiness. She chose not to live inside that mirror. That's not my triumph. That's the system functioning. In the months that followed, life sifted itself into its ordinary bins. Yard waste on Tuesdays, recycling on Thursdays. Kids' chalk designs evolved with the weather. Maple took to napping in a patch of sun on the porch during the late afternoons, the exact beam shifting with the seasons. Sometimes she would lift her head when a car slowed to a stop in front of the house across the street, and then lower it again when she recognized the silhouettes, her way of voting safe. That's how dogs contribute to HOA surveys. I suppose binary, immediate, unambiguous. If there's a lesson to narrate for anyone who finds themselves in the tightening loop of HOA drama, it is this: document, don't dramatize. Learn the rulebook better than the people who weaponize it. Translate vague terms into measurable ones. Turn anonymous pressure into formal process. Push for rituals that build culture, recusals read aloud, courtesy notices drafted with respect, policies written in human language. Keep your neighbors in the loop without turning them into a mob. Say less than you can and show more than you need to. Most importantly, remember that the goal is not to win against a person, but to win back a place. We wrapped our story not with a finale, but with a practice. On weekend mornings, our block sometimes gathers informally at the end of the cul-de-sac with coffee cups, exchanging tips on drought-resistant plants and where to get the best mailbox paint that matches the HOA-approved chart. Someone brings dog treats, and Maple accepts hers with a dignity she didn't have to fight for. No one measures the sound of her tail thumping the porch. If they did, it would hover well below any threshold labeled nuisance. On the day the sold rider finally came down and the sign slid into the realtor's trunk, I took the binder from the cabinet and set it on the counter one last time. I removed the printed screenshots, the decibel charts, the correspondence. I shredded the copies I didn't need and kept the essentials. Then I put the slim folder back, closed the drawer, and felt something click that wasn't the cabinet latch. It was the story finishing its loop. The cul-de-sac at dusk looks like 100 other cul-de-sacs at dusk. That's the point. We earned our sameness back from the person who tried to contort it into control. We reshaped it into a kind of sameness that makes room for life. Dogs that bark once, kids who chalk noise into pavement, neighbors who wave with spare hand because they aren't clutching letters. The viral headline version of our story ends with a flourish, but mine ends with a routine: leash, loop, light on, book open, dog asleep. In a week, the tipping point passed. In the months after, we built something sturdier than a takedown. We built normal.